to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have a special guest, Stephen Bryen, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, to discuss a very interesting topic, which is how Iran and Houthis are using increasingly high-tech assistance in pursuit of their maritime offensive in the Red Sea and other nearby strategic waterways. And specifically, we're talking about AIS tracking system, and we'll get to that momentarily. Why all of that is coming up now is that after a series of attacks on commercial ships in the area, as well as U.S. warships, US, UK responded with some airstrikes which precipitated additional aggression by the Houthis. Iran's been also abducting, hijacking vessels and oil tankers in the area. The Biden administration finally decided to redesignate the Houthis as a whole, as a terrorist organization, but we come to find out this morning that far from simply re-putting them on the same list as President Trump's administration near the end of the term, it actually put them on a lower ranking list, although theoretically speaking, there are two separate terrorist organization designations, and the Houthis could be eligible for both of them simultaneously. Moreover, from what I'm hearing, this designation was hollowed out by the issuance of 5 general licenses, which essentially allows Houthis to go on with much of their activity uninhibited from specific prohibitions. So these exceptions make this framework null and void for all intents and purposes, and how that affects their procurement of advanced technology is something that we'll get into this episode. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a very important topic, and while we've been talking a lot about Iran's and Houthis' strategic objectives in the area, not much has been discussed in terms of the technical access and the specific methods they use to achieve these objectives. And before we get into all that, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your interest in this issue?
Sure. Well, I have a long career. I'm not a spring chicken, as they say. I started first as a professor, then as a political science, international politics, then as on Capitol Hill for the Foreign Relations Committee, where I was the staff director of the Near East Subcommittee for a number of years. After that, I went to the Pentagon, where I was a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy and was responsible for high-tech U.S. exports to friendly and not friendly countries. Seems like we have a lot of both. And then after that, I became the president of a very large multinational defense company in the United States. I was the U.S. president of that company for about 11 years. So that's kind of a quick background, give you an idea. I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but I've had lots of scientists and engineers who work for me. So I learn a lot because I ask a lot of questions. So that's how I get my knowledge, if you want to call it that. And I'm obviously concerned about the Houthi situation. I'm very concerned about the Middle East, generally speaking, because it's become a real problem thanks to the Iranians. And I think they're the main agent provocateur that we have to keep our eye on.
That's an important point, and I will get to that because many of the Houthi capabilities come thanks to efforts by Iran. It has been smuggling ballistic missiles, drones, missile parts through the port of Hodeidah, also over the borders with Oman, with Lebanon, and they've also been directing Houthis into building their own factories on the ground in Yemen. But Well, much of the attention has been on these weapons, on ballistic missiles and drones for good reason. They're used to attack ships, attack countries. Before this current development, the Houthis have been attacking other cities in Yemen. They've been attacking Saudi Arabia, UAE.
Yeah.
So they've had a long and fraught history of being a regional threat. Now, however, they are threatening to block maritime maritime passageways for international trade, and that makes them more of a global threat directly, and not just a theoretical, and not just in theory as previously. But how is it that now this group of people, which started out decades ago being, just another clan in the north of Yemen, and not particularly sophisticated one at that. They were always made fun of for chewing cud and for dressing a certain way, and all of a sudden we're seeing that they not only present themselves in a very sophisticated way and essentially act as a military rather than a group of terrorists, but they have access to advanced tracking technology. And how do we know that they have that?
Well, how do you pick out a ship in the middle of the Red Sea by and understand that that specific ship in a very busy trafficked area is the one you want to hit because it may have a connection to Israel or now a connection to the United States or the UK. I mean, they're more than capable of doing this. And the way they do it is to use the automatic identification system, or AIS, which all commercial ships use for navigation and safety. So basically every ship over 300 tons is broadcasting a signal from its transponder that gives its name, its actual location, its speed, and heading. So, if you're Houthis or anybody else, in fact, you or I can look that up on the internet, and we can find by name specific ships, and we can figure out, if we have a good research operation, figure out which ones we're interested in. That's how they're doing it. There's no doubt about that.
So
There's no other practical way to do it.
one of the issues that's been at the heart of the matter is an Iranian warship that allegedly was providing the Houthis with the key intelligence to help them in attacks. What is the
I don't think that's exactly accurate. Let me try to explain what I think is the system. And, of course, it's all has to be a little speculative because they're not telling us how they do it. We have to try and figure it out. The Houthis have been using radar, and they've been using AIS, the AIS system. I think this is all being done in Tehran. I don't think I have no doubt at all. The Houthis don't have this capability. They're not that sophisticated. This is sophisticated work. And what you do is you locate a ship with the AIS, and then you get your radar to track it accurately. Because even though AIS is good, it's not that good. It's not that perfect. So to really get it right, you need a radar, which is one of the reasons why the United States is busy trying to knock out their radars. We've knocked out 3 of them so far in that region where on the Red Sea. There is an Iranian ship in the area. There was one before that called the MV Savis, but the Savis was hit by a lipid mine. I think it was Israelis who did it and damaged it enough it had to be towed away, and they have replaced it with another ship. So they have a radar ship, and now they've brought also a warship, an old one, but nonetheless a warship, into the Red Sea to shadow our own ships there, and they're capable of communicating with the land and to let the Houthis know about targets. So if we knock out radars, they have other radars. That's the problem. Have I explained it in any way that makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. So the first question is a little bit of a practical. Given this reality, what can the commercial and other ships in the area do to protect themselves?
Well, there are a bunch of recommendations about that in terms of protection. One of them is, to obviously have armed guards on the ship, because not only have they been targeting them with UAVs and missiles, but they also have been trying to board those ships with commandos, either using small boats or helicopters or both. So there's a definite risk to ships that way. But I'm also suggesting that uh, uh, that it's very important to consider another thing, which I think is that the AIS system sends out information every 7 to 10 seconds, which is quite a lot, and that is a problem, because it helps the Houthis target. But if you could delay those transmissions or make them less frequent, then they're not so useful for targeting. So I think that's something else that could be done, but it would need some experts to say the best way to do that. I'm not one of those experts, but I think it can help. I mean, there's no perfect solution here, other than to destroy all the Houthi capabilities, which is we're trying to do, but it's very hard, because some of those capabilities, like drones, are very hard to find. You can hide them in a house, you can hide them anywhere, in a garage, whatever. So those are difficult. The missiles are a little bit easier, because you can see them with aircraft or satellites or whatever you want. They're more visible, and you can. In fact, we just hit a missile field, cruise missile field, I think, or a ballistic missile field. I'm not sure which. Just yesterday. So that is definitely a target that we can go after. The drones are more difficult.
So there's been a talk about the White House issuing an advanced warning to Houthis with the motivation of limiting the impact and not provoking a greater confrontation than necessary. And basically, the communication was, oh well, we're just trying to stop you from messing with the freedom of navigation, and later on we're signaling to Iran that you'd better stop it or else. To what extent has this allowed the Houthis to manage their capabilities, and basically what was the impact of that warning? What exactly have they been able to remove from harm's way?
Well, I'll give you, that's a very good question. I think very important question. There's two levels, or two answers, I guess you could say, to what you're asking. I mean, one is the policy confusion in Washington. And you alluded to that earlier when you were speaking about the terrorist list and where they put the Houthis and where they should be, and what are the implications for export controls and all the rest.
And we'll get more into that later.
Well, yeah, but they've made a big mess, let's face it. I mean, and when you make a big mess, trouble comes. So on the policy level, they have difficulty. The other is they can't make up their mind what their mission is here, because they're afraid Iran will enter the war. I hate to tell them the news, but they don't seem to get it. Iran is in the war. This is an Iranian operation. This is not a Houthi operation. Yeah, the Houthis give the press conferences, but this is an Iranian operation all the way. Iran is still shipping in missiles. There was on the 11th, one of our naval vessels, the U.S. Lewis B. Puller, captured a dhow. It's a wooden sailing ship loaded with missile parts going to the Houthis from Iran. And that was very interesting for another reason, but we can talk about. But the fact that dhow was delivering these missiles now tells you who's running the show. It's coming from Iran. May I say one thing about that dhow, which is
yes, please.
one of the weapons found on that vessel was a copy, either a copy or a real one, but I think it was a copy of the C-802 missile, the anti-ship missile. The C-802 is a turbine-powered anti-ship missile originally made by the Chinese, and the Iranians have a copy of it called the Noor, N-O-O-R, Noor. I'm not sure how it's written in Persian, but it's Noor. In any case, that missile has an active radar seeker. So my guess is what's going on is that the current crop of Houthi weapons, especially the cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles, don't have active radar seekers good enough to target ships accurately. So the Iranians are now pushing in these newer, or they're not really new, but these newer weapons from the point of view of the Houthis that can use radar homing to hit the targets. They're much more expensive missiles than the ones the Houthis have been using, but they're more accurate. So we have a big problem on our hands here.
I'm going to ask a question that may sound a little bit provocative, but I think it makes sense in the context. As we know, Chinese ships and Russian ships have been not been targeted to the point that other ships started announcing themselves as Russian or Chinese vessels to avoid being made targets. But we also know that in the past, China has provided the Houthis with parts of drone technology incorporated into the Iranian products, UAVs that they were giving them. To what extent is China involved in the technical aspects of this operation? Are Iranians simply selling or giving away what China has provided them in the context of the relationship, or is Beijing assisting in any aspect of what's going on?
Well, I think you can say clearly Beijing company or Chinese companies are providing the components, most of the components for the drones and for these other systems which we've talked about. There's no doubt about that. And they have a very close cooperation with Iran. And since I think Iran is the front door to the Houthi operation, the stuff comes in the front door and then goes out the back door to the Houthis. But it's a lot of it's Chinese. Now, if you tear down some of these things, unfortunately, if you tear them open and you see what's in them, you'll also find the parts that come from the United States and from Europe. So it's not just China.
How do these American parts get to Iran?
Globalization is the simple, short answer to your question. A lot of semiconductors, for example, that are used in the drones we're seeing in Ukraine and by the Russians, and the same thing we're seeing from the Houthis and the Iranians both, are parts that are bought on the international market. They're not controlled by export controls. So they're freely available. And the US has made no effort whatever to deal with this problem. It's a disgrace because it's US stuff. And then major US companies, AMD, Xilinx, just to name a couple off the top of my head, and there are plenty of others. All this stuff we find in these drones. And yet nothing has been done, not a thing, to try and deal with that problem. So it's coming back to haunt us, as they say.
From my understanding, the export import control restrictions on some of the technologies has been difficult even when there is a concerted effort, like with the semiconductor related technologies that are still going to China, even despite specific restrictions, and the chips that are, various degrees of advanced make have also been making their way to China, for instance. So what is it about the export-import control structure that lends itself to being exploited, and why exactly has the policy been so negligent with respect to these crucial components?
The US has no interest in export controls at all. I mean, ever since 1996, when the US decided it wanted to open up in a big way to the Chinese and get rid of the COCOM, the coordinating committee that the US led for many, many years, trying to restrict exports, and got rid of that. So it's basically a sham. And there are no export controls because the US was looking for trade and wanted to make money and wanted partnerships because they saw China as a huge market, which it is, by the way. And so they wanted a big piece of that. So it's all about money and trade, and it has nothing to do with export control. The export control system today is a total and complete and abject failure.
In my understanding that even within restrictions, there are all sorts of waivers and exceptions that have been implemented at different points in time and facilitated the sale of things that shouldn't have gone.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to see how it's been manipulated. But the point is that they no longer have a proactive effort to control sensitive exports to just about any. So that's gone. Now, could it be put back? Yeah, maybe. I'm not completely sure myself. I ran it for the Pentagon for 7.5 years. I was the chief Pentagon guy on U.S. export controls when we had real export controls. So I know a little bit about it. And it's difficult even when you have a desire and an organization to deal with it, but it's impossible under the current circumstances.
So what exactly is U.S. hoping to achieve by these limited airstrikes? Are they hoping that the airstrikes alone will be enough of a deterrence for Houthi/Iran to stop what they're doing, or do they think they can damage enough that they will simply not be able to engage with the same level of aggression?
Officially, if judging from official statements, because that's all we have to go on, is the idea is to discourage the Houthis from doing this. But they're not going after the right targets.
What
because
should be?
if you're just shooting at radars and ballistic missile stuff and all that, the Houthis will just keep shooting it off. Iran will keep giving them more. You have to go after the leadership. The only way to get the message to them is to go after the leadership, which is quite exposed, but we're not doing it.
What exactly?
So the U.S. policy is a bit self-limited.
What exactly prevents U.S. from taking out some of these leaders? After all, in the past, this has been effective. Qasem Soleimani's assassination essentially disrupted many of the major Iranian operations and left them scrambling. They rebuilt their networks, but in a different way from previously, and left a lot of gaps open, as we can see from
Well,
their.
I'm sure there's a policy debate about that, in the government here in the U.S. But I think they're very reticent to do much more than they're doing because they say we don't want a bigger war in the Middle East. They're getting a bigger war in the Middle East anyway, but they're not doing anything about it.
But let's say let's put Iran aside for a moment. Let's focus on what the U.S. identified as a legitimate target, which is the Houthis. Why aren't they taking out the Houthi leadership after all?
Good question. I mean, because they don't want to do that. I don't think that Washington feels politically able to do that now. Okay, they're already being criticized for the Houthi limited attacks that they're doing. So the Biden administration is threatened heavily by the left in the United States and abroad, in Europe too. And it's not a surprise that all the Europeans, except for the UK, decided not to really support the coalition designed to protect shipping in the Red Sea. It's not surprising at all.
But given the impact of these, attacks on the shipping costs and all these other economic factors, given the fact that there's an open economic warfare against Western interests going on, how do they expect to survive economically if they allow an adversarial force to keep attacking the ships? What is the
You're talking about the Europeans?
Yes. What is the calculus here?
You need to ask them. I don't think they have a calculus. They just don't want to do it.
What exactly is everyone's interest in the Houthis? Why is this highly radicalized group of individuals that has taken most of the country hostage and has prided itself of being more radical than the Tehran regime? Why do they have so much international deference? What are people afraid of?
Well, it's political. Look, if you go on Amazon, I assume that in Israel, people have Amazon as much as we are stuck with it here. If you go on Amazon, they're selling T-shirts. They're ridiculous T-shirts that say, I stand with Yemen. Now, they mean I stand with the Houthis. But they don't know the difference, okay? But just because they're stupid. But in any case, it shows just how dumb the political situation is right now. There's especially in the U.S. with pro-Palestinian and pro-Houthi protests. Can you imagine such a thing? Protesting the fact that innocent ships are being shot at in international waterways in the Red Sea. That's okay? What makes that okay? And then they say and it goes beyond that. They say, oh, it's justified because of the genocide that the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Well, it's not justified that way. You can't justify something like that. But anyway, this is the kind of nonsense that we're getting inundated with, and it's all over social media. It's all over the Western press because it's run by a bunch of idiots. And that's the kind of stuff we're getting. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. It's a very bad situation. And there's very little pushback. Nobody told, the government doesn't really say much. It just does that's CENTCOM, our Central Command operation, which is running the ships and the planes and stuff in the Red Sea area and the Gulf of Aden and Persian Gulf. It lets them do their thing, but it's not really defending them. Have you heard Biden stand up and say, this is something we need to do? It's very important to stop the Houthis? No, they're all quiet. Or Blinken, the Secretary of State, who runs around wants a Palestinian state, but it has nothing much to say about the Houthis. I mean, it's ridiculous. And that's what we're in. We're in a political crisis, and it's a big one. It's a big one in the United States. Now, it's a minority. It's a true minority. And I think that will, when the U.S. finally gets around to elections in a year, we'll be able to see that. But right now, it's a very noisy and difficult and troublesome.
Well, the Houthis are priding themselves on essentially being anti-American, specifically being dedicated to destruction of the United States, not just to Israel, but specifically the US. And I think they're unique in the sense of being as open about it as they are now.
Well, the Iranians say the same thing.
True, but they are very specific about the fact that on the one hand, they're a regional local organization that wants a takeover of Yemen. On the other hand, they seem to have loftier goals than their local governance issues in their very slogan and in their very advanced propaganda networks. That should be signaling to the United States that there is more going on to temporary disruption of trade. There is a coherent strategy because you don't just say you want to destroy the US without
Look,
actually.
the U.S. has not wanted to understand the Houthis any more than they wanted to understand Iran, especially in the Biden administration. And before that, in the Obama administration, they didn't want to know about it. Look, they took them off the terrorist list when Biden got in office a week after. Took them off and told the Saudis and the UAE to stop it, not to be involved in any more attacks or whatever you want to call them, operations in Yemen. Stop it. So what did that do? That allowed the Houthis to really jack up their armaments because now all that stuff could come in with no opposition, whatever. The U.S. didn't inspect ships or stop arms from going there, nothing. And so we brought it about ourselves. But we should have understood what they're about. We certainly understand what Iran is about. If we don't, we're stupid. But I think we do, but we just don't care. It's a very strange situation. Iran is now, it's controlling Iraq, it's controlling Lebanon, it's controlling Syria, it's controlling Yemen. This is a very dangerous situation. Very, very dangerous. And the U.S. I've heard today that we pulled out, I'm not sure it's confirmed, that we pulled out a small base that we had in Syria, pulled our troops out. It's very sad.
We also have a significant northern Yemeni diaspora in the US, in New York and other places. To what extent has the Houthi presence been established on the ground in the US? We don't hear about it all that much, but somebody is galvanizing these networks for for the pro-Houthi demonstrations all of a sudden. So they must have some sort of a domestic presence here.
I don't know anything about it.
Mhm.
That's not my field. I deal with technology and with things like that. But I think it's much bigger than that. It's part of, when it gets, first of all, it's all part of this uh, movement to condemn the United States, to condemn Israel. That's the heart of it. To sever the relationship between that was built up thanks to the peace agreements with various countries like the UAE, to break that whole. They want to break it. They want to prevent Saudi Arabia from ever joining the Abraham Accords. All this is part of that pattern. Um, and of course, the thing in the U.S. is now we have terrible anti-Semitism in our college campuses, very heavy in our society. Uh, Vile things are happening, and very little is being done to counteract it. So when you look at that, that can't be just some people from northern Yemen. That's not where it's coming from. It's a much bigger problem.
Speaking of bigger problems, getting back to this whole policy restructuring, this mess with the sanctions and designations and policy directives and licensing requirements. What exactly, with this new framework in place, with the Houthis symbolically being relisted as, nominal terrorists, what exactly are they still able to do with these new licensing exceptions? What kind of technologies or products could they still get their hands on, legally speaking?
Well, one of the things I wrote about, which is interesting, is that they were apparently, they and the Iranians were buying services from U.S. satellite companies uh, that are using in their weapons. We could stop that. Could stop that in 5 seconds very easily by canceling all those accounts, turning it off. And those companies are international companies, but one of them is based right here near where I live, here in McLean, Virginia. So those companies, they're not been asked to do anything, but they should be. And now that there's a terrorist designation, they should be required to do it. And most of them have U.S. ownership. So I think a lot of we could cut that down, and that would, I think, do some damage.
At one point, the Houthis literally took over the telecommunications network in Yemen, essentially seizing power over those networks and using them to broadcast their propaganda. And at
Yeah.
that point, the US remained silent, despite the fact that this was obviously a hostile act by a group of, radicalized individuals. So one fundamental issue in all of this, incoherence, lack of,
Yeah.
policy direction, is to what extent does the United States understand the distinction between an enemy and a non-enemy? To what extent are they able to make this distinction within tribal contexts and contexts where, you have multiple parties vying for power? Because
I,
to
I
me,
think the policy confusion is so deep in Washington, and it runs through all the agencies so far, and that it's almost incurable. But we have no leadership on this really, and where we have it, it's in the wrong direction. We're not exploiting our strengths at all. We have lots of strength, not just bombs. We have a lot of other strengths, and a good team of dedicated personnel in the government could really make a difference today, and make it tougher for Iran and for the Houthis and anybody else to do damage to our interests. And that's fundamental policymaking. It's not being done. They're not doing anything
so what?
other than CENTCOM. I have to say, CENTCOM is terrific. And I'm very, very happy with what CENTCOM is doing. But the rest of the government's sleeping. Incidentally, I read, and I know I can't prove this is true, but I read that the CENTCOM was trying to do targeting against these things in the Houthi-controlled areas, the missiles and such, that the CIA had nothing on it. They never did any work. They didn't know where anything was. So if that's true, and I suspect it is, that tells you the story. The government's disorganized. The key agencies that have tremendous resources could do a lot more than they're doing. We could approach private companies that are aiding and abetting terrorists, and Houthis are now terrorists again, like it or not, and tell them they can't do that anymore, and to help us put an end to it. We could do all that, but we're not doing it. So my message is let's turn it around and let's start doing those things. And if we can and do it quickly, we could have a lot of impact.
Well, to me, it sounds that aside from the fundamental problem of intelligence agencies not doing their job, perhaps because they were directed not to do it, and perhaps for other reasons, we could simply get that information from regional actors. We have allies in the region who have been embroiled in that local conflict for 8 years, and I'm sure have access to the locations of all these.
If you want to hear that, yeah, you're right. If you want that information, if you want to hear about it, if you want to be, up to date on what's going on, you could do all that. But my belief is we're not. Or if we got the information, we're burying it someplace. Look, tons of information come in through various channels into the U.S. government, public and private, satellites. It goes on all different ways. But if you're not interested, you put it in we call it the circular file. That's called a trash can. And you forget about it. You had a similar problem in Israel, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an unknown phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we're actually in a war, as you are in Gaza, and maybe with Hezbollah in the north, now that we're actually in a war, the game has changed. And we should have the best of the best working on this problem. Yet I don't see it. I don't see it at all.
What it seems to me that one of the problems is that these symbolic decisions are really kind of one-off and very reactionary. It seems to me that there needs to be a comprehensive strategy on different issues: the military, the intelligence, the communications, the export-import control, and so forth.
Yeah, but if you think of the government as a big ship, okay, by putting that kind of designation in place, that helps the ship to start to turn. And you want the ship to turn. That's very important. What's missing is the internal government leadership to really be serious, and to not think, well, CENTCOM can shoot some rockets off and some, let them do that. And think that solves the problem. Doesn't solve anything, not by itself. So you have to do all the other things with it. Once the Iranians and the Houthis, to a lesser extent, because I don't think they're important, but once the Iranians understand we're organized and we're going to be tough and serious, then they know they have another kind of problem. So if we're going to accommodate them, and essentially allow them to run wild over these territories where they're operating, and supply weapons ad infinitum to our enemies, then that's another different thing. It's bad.
So here's another issue, and that comes to fundamental again basics of policy. We have two special envoys, one on Yemen, Lander King, and one on on Iran. Now it's Mali is gone, so his deputy has taken over temporarily. And
maybe they should be both sent on vacation.
Long vacation. Who exactly is charged with the policy decisions on these issues. We see that the State Department is putting up this designation and CENTCOM is running the military, but who is actually dealing with the big policy questions on this? Who is the decider, to put it in the immortal words of George W. Bush?
Usually in such situations where you have a complex problem, it's coordinated out of the National Security Council.
Mm-hmm.
And the National Security Council has experts or brings in experts from other agencies to organize and plan operations and to set policies. I don't see any sign of that being done. I mean, I worked in the U.S. government. I worked in the U.S. Defense Department. I worked with the NSC. I worked with state. I worked with the agencies, the intelligence agencies. I know them all. And when we set our mind to something, we did it. But right now, I don't see it. That's who you want to know, who's in charge, who's running the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the president delegates that to the NSC. The NSC then hands out marching orders to the agencies, and it coordinates all that, and it centralizes the operation. Or occasionally sets up a special task force if the problem requires that. But all that is, there's no Yemen task force that I know about. There's no Iran task force that's multifaceted. There's negotiators, but negotiators are there to give away things, not to stop things. They never stop anything. I mean, that's why I said they should go on vacation. We don't need them anymore. Dismiss them, get rid of them. We're not going to negotiate anything with Iran. Nuclear agreement? That's a joke. So why don't we just get organized and do it right? I think we're capable of it, but I don't think we're doing it.
So to what extent would it be the Red Sea problem, the freedom of navigation and so forth, is actually a national security priority for the US? Or to what extent is it being treated as a national security, I should say?
Well, it is it is. I mean, the US is always supporting the freedom of navigation. I mean, that's an American policy, and not only an American policy, but it's certainly a priority of the United States. And we've run what were called freedom of navigation exercises around the world, doing it in the Pacific right now, doing it in the Red Sea, doing it in the Persian Gulf. We've done it in the past. We've escorted tankers through the Persian Gulf in the past to protect them. So yeah, and right now, even our deployments in the Red Sea not only are shooting at the Houthis, but they're also helping ships in distress. So at least they're doing that. So we've done it before. That's a solid U.S. policy. I don't have any problem with that. I think it's good. The difficulty is that we have an adversary that doesn't want to stop being troublesome, and that takes more effort.
So far, all these talks were conducted by US and UK. To what extent do you think it would be possible to get other countries on board with the military aspects of this confrontation, should it come to that point, and should we finally make up our minds to do it?
Well, we certainly have the UK in our camp.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very important. I'm sure Israel is quite happy with what we're doing. As far as other countries, the Europeans especially, and the Japanese. Now, I noted that the USS Abraham Lincoln is an aircraft carrier,
Mm-hmm.
was carrying out exercises, freedom of navigation exercises in the region, and there was a Japanese destroyer along with them. So that's good news. I think that's very important. The real disappointment are the French and the Germans and the Italians who aren't cooperating the way they should be. It's particularly annoying that the Italians, who have a major responsibility for the Eastern Mediterranean and understand what it is and what it takes to protect, keep those sea lanes open, decided not to participate in the U.S. Operation Enduring Effort. So I'm disturbed by that, especially because it has a conservative leader, Maloney, Prime Minister, who should be good on these things, but isn't. So I'm very annoyed. French, you understand. French are the French. They do what they want. But all of them will suffer because of the shutdown of shipping in the Red Sea, because the Suez Canal is the key artery that's bringing products, petroleum and bulk products and other products, including from Asia, to Europe. So to lose that route means they have to go around the south of Africa and all the way up. It's very expensive and time consuming, and it's going to be very costly. So insurance rates have skyrocketed. The cost of operations have skyrocketed. And yet, and that's impacting Europe. And the Egyptians, by the way, also paying a price for this. Surprisingly, the Egyptians aren't helping either.
Well, from what I understand, in Egypt, this whole situation is being sold as pro-Israel. They are claiming, well, because the Houthis are doing it to stop the conflict in Gaza, to stop the war in
Egypt,
Gaza.
yeah, I know, but Egypt earns $751 million a month
Mhm.
from the Suez Canal.
What do you
That's
think would it take to bring Egypt on board? Is it essentially a decision because US has frozen some of the military aid, and so they're making this excuse uh, of not cooperating? Is there a real struggle inside the government that prevents them from taking action? Is it the financial crisis? Is it other security issues that they're prioritizing? What exactly is the real reason?
Well, I think what's driven the Egyptians, you've seen it in their attitude toward the Gaza situation as well, is largely fear of the Muslim Brotherhood,
Mhm.
which, something to worry about for them. It's because there's a lot of them in Egypt, and that's what killed Anwar Sadat.
But isn't the Muslim Brotherhood more likely to take advantage of an economic crisis exacerbated by these attacks and the loss in revenue? Won't it be, better for the government to step in, put an end to all of this, help put an end to all of this, and recover the money, and then not give the Brotherhood the excuse to agitate against them?
I think the real story here is the U.S. hasn't pushed them and hasn't asked them.
Mm. Mhm.
I mean, let's be honest. I mean, they're not going to do anything unless the U.S. really pushes them. The U.S. hasn't asked them to do anything.
Why is that? Wouldn't US want
Bad
more?
policy again. I mean,
Well,
foolish.
from the US perspective, it's better to have a broader coalition, and it's better to have a MENA country in it, a major country, not just Bahrain, to show that there is real security concern that impacts the region, and they're not simply doing it,
As I said, the
for
ship is
show.
starting to turn, but it hasn't fully completed its
Hmm.
turn. The ship of state, meaning the U.S.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of internal opposition. Look, there's a lot of pro-Palestinian support inside the U.S. government, in the White House, okay, in the State Department and in other agencies. They were put there by Biden. Let's face it, he loaded it up with all these pro-Palestinian people. So you have that problem. You have a policy divide inside the State Department. They're not sure where there was opposition to the idea of putting them back on the terrorist list. They wanted them off. That was their agenda. So yeah, we haven't turned the ship fully around yet. Whether it's possible in this administration is an open question. I think Biden is very reluctant to do much of anything except try and keep the lid on things until he's reelected. That's his. The same goes for Ukraine, and the same goes for a lot of the Pacific and Taiwan and Korea and all over the place. So things are in drift. At best, things are in drift. And when things are in drift, trouble comes because everybody sees things are in drift. The U.S. doesn't really have a policy. The U.S. is confused. The U.S. is weak, on and on and on. So they take advantage, exploit it.
Let's look at the projections. Given this, temporary lack of US cohesive policy and disruption of procurement of technologies on the Houthi part and on Iranian part, how far can Iranians and their proxies in the region take this technical cooperation and telecommunications and all this that allows them this targeting these operations Iran is abducted, has used electronic jamming to abduct some of these ships. To what extent this hybrid warfare can rise to the next level, and what would that look like?
Why should it? I mean, if you can get everything you want with hybrid warfare, why do you need the next level?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't. And if you do, you use your proxies to do it. So if you unleash Hezbollah, for example, okay, if they get killed, they get killed, but it's not, it's not their problem. And so I don't know that they need to, given their objectives. Now, if they want to make war on the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and actually use Iranian assets directly against US bases, they will find out that the US doesn't like such things. And the US will respond and will be in a war with Iran in 5 minutes. They know that. So they're not doing that. They're using proxies. But if they want to try it, they will, but they don't need to yet. Now, I think the real thing they're aiming for, in my humble opinion, is the destruction of Israel. They've made that very clear.
Mm-hmm.
They've been organizing for years in Lebanon and Syria to carry out major attacks on Israel, not just in Gaza. I think Gaza was sort of a sideshow. I didn't expect it to be that successful. But it certainly drained Israel of money, manpower, everything. It's been very painful. And so I'm sure they're happy in Tehran. But they really want to break Israel altogether. And so will they expose themselves that way? I don't know. That's, you have plenty of experts in Israel have a better grasp of that than I do. But my guess is that's what they're after. Anyway, they say they're after. It's not a secret.
Interestingly enough, one of the things that we saw is territorial expansion of this conflict, not only the layers of attacks on, more targets, but we saw Iran directly target a tanker off the coast of India, which prompted India to send its own manpower into the region. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why Iran might want to do that. Previously, it's had solid relations with India, but India is now joined the Quad. It's doing a lot of military training with the, U.S. countries, with the U.S. and its allies. So, it may just be a message. But what is the risk of Iran seriously trying to really cause more of a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific, and then China joining in on this sort of
I don't see the Chinese doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, don't. I mean, they're happy to supply all the stuff that the Iranians want. And they might even put a token ship out there to say, hey, we're here. But to get engaged in hostilities with the United States somehow, no, they don't want that. Or if they do want it, they want it in, near their backyard, near Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have any great interest in Iran other than getting oil from them. But and buying military products that the Chinese dump into Iran. And there's nuclear cooperation too. But I don't think they want that kind of confrontation. The Indian thing's rather odd, the ship that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Very strange event. But I would also point out that the Iranians attacked a town in Pakistan just yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Bombed it.
Yeah, I mean,
And the Pakistanis have broken diplomatic, or at least they recalled their ambassador from Tehran. So they're very angry, but they won't do anything about it either.
No. The issue with Pakistan is a little bit less mysterious because they have a history of joint operations against Baluchi operatives who've targeted Iran. I think in this case, Iran may have been under pressure to show its pro-security credentials after they missed the ISIS attack, and they may have rushed and just not coordinated with Pakistanis, which explains this diplomatic.
When you bomb another country's territory, it's an act of war.
It is, but
Simple as that.
it is
If
technically
you're going to live with
but
it, you live
yeah.
with it. But they bombed it. So the Turks have just bombed Syria and Iraq.
Absolutely. But again, Iraq and Syria have both been putting up with it because they claim that the Turkey is targeting PKK and that doesn't really concern them. So there's been this tacit understanding among all these players.
You can
India
explain
thing,
anything
I
you
don't
want.
believe there is a tacit understanding when you target India's tanker. That is not some specific terrorist group that you have a record of previously targeting jointly, or that you have this implicit understanding. I think it's a
I think that
different.
tanker was, they claimed it was Israeli, but it turns out that it wasn't.
So it was a mistaken, misidentification or.
Right.
Mhm.
It did a
But
lot of damage to it. It had to be towed.
wow, it's yeah. So that is interesting though that it would go as far as they did though, because this is much.
When you have a vacuum and where the US doesn't know what day it is and what it's doing,
Mhm.
then you exploit it. This is exactly what they're doing. There's no doubt about that. And they'll do it more until someone cracks them on the head. And then they'll stop or pause until they get the next chance. But that's how they operate. So you have to do this, you have to push back. And we're not, we let them shoot at our bases in Iraq using their Shia proxies in Iraq to do it. The last time they did it, they fired missiles right from Iran in Erbil. That's another attack on a foreign country. Now, it's not ours, but it was. And by the way, they claim they attacked the Mossad headquarters in Erbil. But anyway, they attacked another country. And what did the U.S. say about it? Can you
It's
answer that
been a
question?
very toothless statement.
It said nothing,
Yeah.
nothing at all, zero. Oh, that's terrible. That's not nice. Don't do that again.
Mhm.
That's ridiculous.
From what I understand, they killed a Kurdish billionaire with the oil interest
And
in.
his family.
Yes, yeah. So that's kind of a big deal. This is, first of all, it's a civilian person. Second of all, it's a well-known figure. It's not just, somebody incidentally damaged on the street that no one's ever heard of. This is,
They
a
said
big
he was
name.
working for Mossad.
Well, they make those claims, but obviously they're also not happy that Kurds
I
have.
think they missed their target
Mhm.
and they blew up his home.
I they've been
They fired 10 Fatah 110 missiles, ballistic missiles, 10 of them.
that's a pretty serious attack.
It's a very serious attack. But again, the U.S. My friend Richard Pearl used to call these State Department statements, with officially they're called demarches, and he called them demarshmallows.
That's a good way of putting it. Speaking of that, final question I have for you is sort of on the defensive side. So the Houthis, the targeting of all these vessels, they see that US has clearly much more significant military prowess than they do, and that the defenses have been solid no matter how many drones and missiles they've been firing in the general direction of US warships and such. Why do they keep doing it? What are they hoping to achieve from that perspective? Technically, they're not doing much damage. They're wasting their own weapons on targets that are far above their head. What
No,
exactly is the
no,
plan?
no, 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 no. They're hoping to get a lucky hit. They're
Mm,
hoping to hit a U.S. warship. This is not just wasting ammunition.
hmm
This has a very, and they're starting to use swarm tactics to try and overwhelm the Aegis system that is defending these ships, the Aegis missile system. So yeah, I mean they're trying to get a hit. There's not much doubt about that.
So there's a calculated risk. They understand.
I think they're crazy because if they hit a U.S. ship, the U.S. will send B-52 bombers and wipe them out.
So this is the part that I don't understand. Iran is on one hand is fully in control of all these operations. They're trying to wreak havoc, pushing US, taking advantage of its weakness. On the other hand, they know there are red lines that US cannot cross, and there's this
They don't
real
care.
risk of
No, because look, again, from the Iranian point of view, what's the difference? So the
Mhm.
Houthis get wiped out? Too bad. Didn't cost Iran anything much. and they humiliated the United States.
So these are the sorts of risks
Sank an
that,
American destroyer or American aircraft carrier. It's the same dream that the Chinese have about our aircraft carriers and destroyers in Asia, near China. They
well,
dream about sinking them. They, in fact, not only they dream about it, they
mhm.
put mock-ups of our aircraft carriers in the desert and they bomb them, practicing. So, this is understandable. But the Iranians are smart enough to understand they're not doing it. Those guys are doing it. Too bad. They get killed.
Do you think there
The
can
U.S.
come?
has to make up its mind about Iran.
Mhm.
That's the big issue. That's the overwhelming issue in the Middle East today. There's no bigger issue than that. That's the single most serious problem. And they better get it done before they have nuclear weapons, because then they won't be able to do it.
But let's face it, in the past, when Iran did engage in direct hits against strategic targets, such as the Aramco attack, and nobody, including the US, wanted to name them as the culprit because everyone was afraid of confronting an escalation and whatnot.
Yeah, I agree.
Escalation came regardless, as we see, but now Iran gets this idea that no matter what, as long as they're stay behind the scenes and let someone else do the job, they're not going to be
Well, they're not
suffering.
behind the scenes. They're just not they're not executing for the most part, the attacks. Now, the Erbil attack is something else, and the Aramco attack you mentioned, which was against the two oil facilities, Abaqaiq and Kurayas. That attack was from Iranian territory. They took a big risk, but they were pretty convinced the U.S. would do nothing, which is exactly what happened. And they were also convinced the Saudis wouldn't do anything because the U.S. wouldn't let them, which is also what happened. So in those circumstances, you can get away with things. But if you hit an American military ship, it's a different story.
Mhm.
Totally different story. It's not some commercial operation. And if you do that, let me just tell you very clearly, without any hesitation, and no matter what Biden thinks or any of these other jokers think in the government, we're going to have to take military action against them, period.
Do you think they understand that? Is there a clear understanding
They
of
think
it?
they can get away with it. I think they're
No,
foolish.
no, not Iran. Do you think US understands that it would have to take military action? The US government, not the
I don't
Pentagon.
know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Right now, no. No, they're just hoping it'll go away, because
Wow.
I think the U.S. policy is primarily to delay anything that would impact the coming election negatively in terms of the current administration. What they don't understand is that the longer this goes on, the greater the risk of a confrontation is, and that they might actually hit a U.S. warship.
So essentially, Iran is far better at calculating the risk to their own interest than the US is.
So far, yeah. So far.
That's the conclusion to be
Well,
drawn.
I mean, have you any evidence that anybody's pushed back on Iran for anything?
No?
Okay, you answer your own question.
Exactly. Well, let's hope that this does not get any farther than already has, and hopefully, everyone will come to their senses and start doing the right thing, for everyone's.
From your mouth to God's ear.
Yeah. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was an enlightening conversation. I think many people are simply not aware of the degree of this technical advancement that is present in these operations. I think the international image of Houthis, or for that matter, even Iran, has been somewhat naive, to put it mildly. And I think what we're seeing is an increasingly serious technical problem, and which we should be taking seriously.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you for the first time. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And to everyone watching, please tune back on next Tuesday at 9 p.m. for our next program. Thank you so much for joining us today.